Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today I'm going to talk to a dear friend of mine, Leon Kosals. And we're going to talk about a topic that I hadn't really thought about. He's a sociologist too, as I am, only I'm retired and he's far from retired. He, in fact, covers two different countries. He teaches at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, which is, I understand, maybe the best university in Russia these days. And he also teaches at the School of Criminology at the University of Toronto. And normally he lives half each year in Toronto and half each year in Moscow. And his family lives here in Toronto, which is a very challenging and interesting way of living. So I never know where he is when I want to call him because I always get it wrong. But this time he's been in Toronto the whole year because of COVID. And the interesting thing is, he tells me that he's been teaching his course in Moscow to the students by Zoom, just as he teaches his course in Toronto to his students by Zoom. And here we're going to have a Zoom conversation. Good morning, Leon.
Good morning, Metta. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always fun to talk to you. And I always learn something new. Okay, let's plunge into one of the interesting, we had a little warm up getting acquainted because I hadn't thought to call you. I kind of thought you were away. But let's tell me again what you told me 5 minutes ago about the thing that's going on in terms of the discrepancy between the anti-foreign, what do they call it, xenophobia in Russia, of the general press, and the internationalization of higher education. What's that all about? I mean, it's very interesting news.
I agree, Metta. It sounds interesting because on the one hand, Russia has definitely the track of internationalization of the higher education. And they introduced the system of BA and MA, this kind of approach to the higher education that borrowed from the West, first of all probably from US, and additionally it was set up the criteria for evaluation of the professor's activity based on their publications on the international journals, mostly in English. And actually it's the relations between Russian universities and foreign universities in Europe and in North America, in Asia, in other countries, it's actually the part of the policy. And authorities push the universities do that and provide money for these relations. They established a ambitious program of very big grants for joint projects of prominent international scholars in Russian universities. They incentivize students to learn English and to pass the exams, TOEFL, IELTS. So it's a policy of internationalization. It's even in bureaucratic terms.
Well, how long has this trend been going on? I actually had never heard about it before.
It's a long-term trend, and during last more than decade, it's obvious. It's an obvious trend, especially when Russia has a lot of money from oil and gas price increase, and the authorities they have money for that. A part of this money were headed to this policy of the internationalization of higher education. Maybe in not so big percentage, but some money were invested,
mhm, mhm,
and it's going on.
mhm,
It
mhm.
is not stopped in spite of the trends in the general policy. It looks partially counter not maybe xenophobic because official policy it's not xenophobic for sure, but if you look at general media, you can find a lot of hostile statements of journalists, of members of talk shows, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
Therefore, the whole discourse it's not so favorable for development of international relations.
yeah.
But
Well, that
the
that has
policy
been
of international
my own experience with even friends. And now, fortunately, you're a good enough friend, so it hasn't happened yet. So let's guarantee we will remain friends. But I must say, I have run into Russians who I thought we were on good terms, and there was a degree of resentment toward me because because I'm not Russian, or at least maybe because I'm American and Canadian, and I was surprised because I don't see anti-Russian attitudes in North America or anywhere Europe. I don't see that.
yeah.
There's anti-Putin. Yes, there's
But
populist.
it's political issues.
These are political issues,
Yeah.
but I don't see that Western people that I know are exhibiting sort of a general resistance to or suspicion of Russians. In as a Do you? There's a big difference between
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree with that. If we talk about politics, about some political matters, it's one issue. But other issue, social attitudes towards ethnic group or towards any national, it's other issue. It's separated here in North America, in Canada, in US, and in Europe. But in Russia, these issues are together.
Mhm, mhm.
So it's
Yeah, why do you
yeah.
think that has happened? Has it been a result of a deliberate policy that Putin established to try to whip up well, I don't know whether to call it anti-Americanism or more generally anti-Westernism or what? Or was it
I
spontaneous?
think yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, what do you think?
I maybe in part it's spontaneous, but spontaneous it's not so substantial, because I remember some anti-Western attitudes in Russia in 1990s, but it more or less marginal and moderate.
Mm-hmm.
It was for some politically active part of Russian elite and population, but it was 2%, 5%, something like that. It's
Okay, now
very,
I
very
was going
small and marginal.
in those
Mhm.
days I was going to Russia a lot, and I noticed a change almost overnight uh, because when I think it had something to do with shock therapy because many people that I knew who were members of the party, for example, who I would have thought would be very patriotic to Russian politics, uh, had been very sort of secretly highly favorable to democracy and desiring change and so on. And there would be kind of people would give you a thumbs up or a wink or something if you'd say, because they wanted to show that we're on the same team, even though they
Mhm.
couldn't say that they were concerned about human rights. And I would say it. So that used to be the case. I call those people termites, because I think they were kind of working within the party to make changes. And of course, Gorbachev was their man. He really did it. And then, we had Yeltsin come in, and the introduction of shock therapy, which I thought was, I could see all of a sudden the people who had been pro-democracy were very hostile all of a sudden, and they weren't on the same pro-Western or pro-democracy page at all. When I would visit people, I would have people accuse me of being an imperialist or something, and which hadn't been, at all the case beforehand. So I think that there was a big change at that point. But it seems to me, from what I've heard, and I haven't been going to Russia lately at all, I can't travel that easily, but it seems to me that the attitude now is not quite the same, that the grievances that they experience or imagine are different. And what do you think?
Yeah, I agree, because in 1990s, it was more or less marginal. It was the sentiments of relatively small amount of people, and it probably still in in almost same level, if it will not be a special propaganda efforts from the government.
Well, also if I'm not mistaken, they really had people who resented the West for being responsible for the suffering that shock therapy imposed. They were right. There were a lot of the advice had come from Western elites, economists, and so on, and it was very bad advice, I think.
Honestly, Metta, I cannot share your
No?
point. Yeah, because most of this advice, it's only advices, first of all. Second, nobody knew what was right and what was wrong. And most of the decisions, it were the decisions that made by Russian government. No doubts. And therefore, they could choose. Most of the suffering and so on and so forth, it was, I think, essential byproduct of the transformation from Soviet system to something more democratic and more market oriented. And
So you're saying
it was the same in Kazakhstan, in Poland, and in Hungary, and very, very similar.
I don't think so. I don't know. I'm not an expert, and you are, but I'm gonna argue, because I've heard people say that it worked. The shock therapy actually worked in Poland, but it didn't. It didn't in the former Soviet Union.
It did. It did.
It worked. Well,
yes, it worked. It worked.
but it caused huge suffering.
Yeah,
and
of course.
I remember going on the streets, and people were out in front of their apartment buildings. Every street was lined with people trying to sell their personal belongings, chairs and silverware and old clothes and anything to just plain get enough to eat. And that was terrible.
Metta, I remember this very well, because I lived permanently at that time in Russia, and of course it was not easy, for sure, for all of people, of all of groups, from top to the from bottom to the top. The issue that most of these outcomes was more or less essential. There was no way to avoid it. The only way was kind of Chinese way of transformation. but it was not possible in Russia, unfortunately, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe unfortunately, maybe fortunately. I am not sure that it would be good strategically to do that. I mean, Chinese type of transformation. It's maybe in part it's a theoretical talk about that. However, the Chinese way of transformation, it was allowed for Russia maybe until 1986 or 87. But up to the end of 1980s, the political system was collapsed actually. It was
Okay.
very weak,
Well,
and there's no way to follow this path, Chinese path of transformation. Uh, mm, uh,
Well, look,
uh,
I don't want to argue in favor of the Chinese approach. I want to argue maybe for the Yavlinsky approach, because I remember interviewing him once about the effect of shock therapy. Of course, he had been the advisor, one of the two people writing proposals for Gorbachev on how to make the transition to capitalism or away from whatever they'd had, and he had a plan, a 500-day plan, and of course he never got to put it into effect because there was the coup and all of that. So,
uh,
but when I
yeah,
asked him
yeah,
about it,
yeah, that's right.
he said, now if you'd let me do, if they'd been allowed me to do what the 500-day plan would have done, there would not have been this 300% inflation. And that in itself was cause of much of the suffering. So, I mean, it wasn't that his approach would have been in any way similar to the Chinese, I don't think.
Yeah. Of course, it's not only Yavlinsky suggested this type of transformation, but for this also should be more or less effective and efficient political system. But it was not the case.
Yeah.
You talked about coup and many other issues.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it was some kind of destroy of political system. Therefore, it kind of in policy making was a kind of reaction on urgent matters, and that's it.
Okay, I think your position is one that I have been arguing when it comes to Gorbachev, because almost every Russian that I've ever met says, well, it was Gorbachev's fault, all these terrible things that happened. But I have always said there wasn't really any way to avoid what happened because he was doing his best and making good decisions, or the best that could have been made, and it didn't work. The Soviet, I mean, he's always blamed for the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he was doing his best to keep the Soviet Union together. It was
Yeah.
really Yeltsin who tore it up, and he didn't get blamed for it. I don't understand.
Uh-huh.
But at any rate, I don't understand why the Russians always blamed Gorbachev for what I gather could, I don't know of a better way. I mean, I don't know whether it would have been possible to avoid the political collapse that took place. Do you?
Yeah, I agree. It's no way to avoid, unfortunately. Uh,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, of course, the problem with this type of transformation that Russia had, it was a problem of disruption and social anomia, and this is it's a very big price. It's very costly for a society and for people.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, to avoid this, you should have kind of Chinese or some other type of regulated transformation. But for that, you should have a plan. You should have a stable political system. You should have trust between population and government, and so on and so forth. No such conditions were in Russia at the end of 1980s, unfortunately.
Right. And he was not trying to make a transformation into an authoritarian system anyway, a regulative system, but rather a democratic one. And I don't know, I mean, that's, if you loosen up things, people are going to take advantage of it, I gather. And it was the Wild West for a while. It's, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Because it was collapse of the old system.
Yeah.
First of all, because of political matters, and it was actually no one person that we could blame for that. Right, on Gorbachev or Yeltsin, it was a kind of collective action
Mhm.
No one planned it.
Mhm.
And then after that, it was a kind of spontaneous, laissez-faire development in politics, in economy, and other realms.
Well, look, today, I think even this morning, I was reading about, I believe Biden, this is changing the subject, but not. Biden has asked for, proposed a conference or something with with Putin
Mm-hmm.
about various issues, of course, including the massing of troops on the border of Ukraine, as if there's going to be another invasion or something. But that's only one of the many issues they need to talk about. And I think Putin has basically rejected the idea of any kind of conference until the US does something or other promises. I've forgotten what he's demanding. But this it looks as if things are getting worse in terms of tension. Maybe the Russians were, at least the Russian government would have been happier with the US when Trump was the president. They're not so happy with Biden. So Buden. That's interesting. I put it together in
Yeah.
a. Yeah. Okay. What do you think is going to happen?
Mm, of course, I don't know. My answer, I don't know. Of course, however, if we firstly talk about the bigger picture, because it's now we have a, from my perspective, we have kind of episode of mm, systemic crisis that Russia experienced during last decade. And these gestures, sometimes it's not easy to understand the motive and the reason of this action. It's a kind of reaction of the Russian government to this crisis. Because this crisis, as in the end of 1980s, it's actually the crisis in economy, in politics, in military, international affairs. And
Yeah. When it comes to sanctions, I think that's the question. The US has imposed sanctions to some extent. And as you mentioned, there's money. They're giving money to the universities, et cetera. So it isn't really that the sanctions have ruined the economy, has it?
I don't think that these sanctions will ruin the Russian economy. However, of course, it will not good for economy, and it will be one of the factors that deteriorate the crisis,
Yeah.
an economic crisis, because during last decade it's serious economic crisis in Russia, and of course one of the factors is sanctions, but not the only and not the major, for sure. But the major factors in outdated economic system, if we talk about economic crisis,
Now, in what way would you say that the Russian economy is an outdated system?
because it's most of the economy actually now controlled by government. It's not a real private
Well,
market, free market.
I hear about oligarchs and that very heavy concentration of wealth, that the
Yeah.
ownership of corporations is by. But I assume these were really private individuals, just the
No,
same as.
no, it's not a case. It's not the private individuals. It's people who are closely connected to the high authorities, and this is an issue because it's a quasi private enterprises, and they can enjoy some government support, but and they can privatize their profits, but it's not a system of private enterprise in the private economy. It's a system regulated by government, and most of the economy now heavily depends on government
Ha.
and political authority in many ways.
Mm.
Therefore, it's very outdated, a very inefficient system, and it cannot provide the incentives for entrepreneurs. And no way for Russia now to do more or less effective private business without any connection with the local or federal authorities. The
Okay.
only
That
small
is,
and
I would say that is news to me. I had not recognized the extent of that. That it,
Oh, it's a very big issue. It's a very big issue, and in fact, there are many proposals how to tackle, how to fix it. However, for that, you should allow the political competition. You should allow
right.
the competition in the economy. You should demonopolize the economy. You should disintegrate these big monopolies and so on and so forth. But it's a matter of political system as well as economic system,
So
both.
when they talk about the oligarchs owning everything, it's they're oligarchs, but they're really controlled by the government.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not in so direct and simple way. It's a kind of symbiosis between these
Mhm.
big men, oligarchs, and the government officials. Therefore, it's a complex system. It's complicated how it works.
Okay, now the first thing that occurs to me is I don't know whether I would contrast that favorably or unfavorably with the Western system in which corporations control everything, and they're not at all democratic. So must say I'm not a socialist and never have been, and I don't know what I am because I want to make corporations more accountable to the public and to the interests of groups, NGOs and environmentalists and feminists and consumers and union workers and all the various elements of society that should be represented in the governance of corporations. But corporations are no saints as they exist now.
Oh, of course, it's not a perfect system for sure. We know well that it's some serious problems with, especially in, for example, in new economy related with artificial intelligence and this fourth industrial revolution. It's a problem with big companies, with these big monopolies. And for example, there just came out the news that the Facebook account of mother of Navalny were blocked because of her statement about the atrocities against her son. And Facebook blocked this post and blocked her account.
Well, okay. So
This is,
I
yeah,
have my own grievances with Facebook every day of
yeah,
the week. My
yeah,
problem is I
yeah,
need them. I need
yeah.
Facebook because, and a lot of us, for very good reason, want to use Facebook for supporting a public discourse, a widened public discourse about political and social issues,
Yeah.
just as we're having this conversation right now.
Hmm.
I bet you a nickel that when I try to post this video to Facebook, they'll say nothing doing. Because yesterday I had one in which I had a conversation among some very, very eminent scholars and a Canadian senator and a number of very senior
Hmm.
thinkers. And I wanted to post it to Facebook, and they wouldn't let me boost it. They wouldn't let me advertise it
Hmm.
because it's about social issues. We're
Hmm.
supposed to spend our Facebook accounts showing pictures of our breakfast or our cats and not
Yeah.
anything serious, and they
Yeah,
won't
yeah, yeah,
talk about
yeah,
so.
yeah. Therefore, a lot of complaints, of course, about Facebook, about Google, about Microsoft, and these big new economy corporations. Therefore, of course, it's not a perfect system for sure. Uh, 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 so my statement about the problems of Russian economy doesn't mean that I think that Google is a saint. It's a perfect
Except
company
that
in a
Facebook
perfect
is, I
world.
think Facebook is worse than the others. I think Facebook is
Mm,
worse than Twitter or Google or LinkedIn
maybe,
or
of
they're
course, it's
bad.
yeah. This is a lot of problems for sure. However, my point here that now Russian economic system inefficient, not in terms of small complaints or some complaints or personal complaints. It's outdated in terms of competition in the global competition of economic systems. Therefore, if we compare it with uh, US, EU, China, Russian economic system now very incompetitive.
Okay, now let's
And
shift from
it's actually it's definitely in crisis, and it's not only economic crisis now that Russia experiences. It's
okay.
a political as well as military strategic crisis. And that we can see in Ukraine from my perspective. It's the evidence of this crisis.
It's the
It's
what? Antidote.
it's an evidence. It's an
Evidence.
evidence of the
Okay.
of this crisis. It's of course it's an aggression. It's an aggression, but it's the behind this aggression. It's a crisis.
Yeah.
It's not an evidence of strength. It's an evidence of weakness.
Well, let's talk a little, not just about the politics, the partisan politics, but also sort of the cultural, ideological developments. You teach students, I suppose, higher, I don't know, are they graduate students or undergraduates mostly that you teach? Both?
Both
Okay.
graduate and
You teach
undergraduate
both
students.
Canadian and Russian students. And so
Right.
you can compare their attitudes better than I would be able to, or many people would be able to. I have sometimes in my encounters with some of my Russian friends, I've been surprised about, for example, the question of global warming. My impression is that absolutely no well educated Western Canadian student or university graduate that I have ever seen would deny the importance and the urgency of handling climate change. But I have run into people in Russians who should know better and who actually are quite skeptical about whether there's such a thing as global warming. And I don't know whether my sample is adequate to reach any generalizations or not. Would you say that in social values, such or societal issues, such as global warming, or you talk about the Ukraine dispute, or and the Crimea, for example, are there significant differences between the students that you teach in Russia and those in Canada?
In general, yes. In these terms, there is a difference, but in not only global but for example, gender relations, and
Really?
yeah,
Really?
problem of social minorities and many other issues. Because if we compare now these two societies, because it's actually evidence of the difference of the mindset of societies. It's not
Mm-hmm.
only the difference between that or these persons, right? And of course, it's we can find this difference between students' attitudes in Russia and Canada, for example, because there are now very different discourse, public discourse in Russia and Canada in terms of global warming, sexual minorities, political tolerance, ethnical tolerance, and so on and so forth. Therefore, but it's because of this kind of official um, government position about all these issues, because officially now Russia followed to conservative values, to kind of very similar that people like Trump propagated. Therefore, yes, we can find it. Of course, not all Russian students have this attitudes. That's a difference. It's not a homogeneous standpoint for all.
Mhm.
But of course, we can face this kind of conservative approach among Russian students frequently, more frequently than in
Mhm.
Canada or
Mhm.
in Europe or in the
Mhm.
US.
Mhm.
That's
Okay.
true. In many aspects, there are no differences between Russians and Canadian students in according to my observations in these both uh, good good universities. Right,
Uh-huh.
so they are well organized, they're pragmatic, they're well educated, they know a lot of things about modern world, about how modern economy works, and the many other issues. There is not so big differences. However, in these societal values, uh, there are differences because of this uh, global differences between
Yeah.
um, two
Now you
countries.
you said that by now you could give courses and you expect to give courses in English
Yeah,
just to Russian students.
yeah, that's
Sociology courses in Russian, I mean
yeah,
in English, even though all the students are Russian.
yeah. That's
You
right.
wouldn't find
Some
anybody giving courses in Russian to Canadian students, I'll
Yeah,
tell you.
yeah, that's right.
No.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay, now
but in
that's
Russia, it is not normal only for high school of economics, but for other universities in not only in Moscow, but in other cities as well, big cities
really.
as well. Yeah, that's right. Now it's definitely Russian universities are much more international than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Therefore, the trend looks very positive.
Now, you say that you
Positive.
once participated in a course that was given to people in England and Russia as a single course, something like that. What was this
It
about?
not was a single course. It was a kind of joint colloquium about the final presentations of the papers. This is
Uh-huh.
a kind of as a small conference, a small graduate conference between, yeah, and it's more or less
But these were
normal.
students,
Yeah,
not. Oh,
for
yeah, okay.
students. Yeah,
That's
it's
wonderful.
yeah, it's a kind of new normal now in Russia.
Uh-huh. That I think it has to be a good thing, although it sounds because it makes it much easier for me because I speak only English. So it's not exactly saying it's not fair to say it's a good thing, but it certainly is both convenient for me and probably a good thing for global culture in general. If we
Yeah.
have more discourse of between,
Hmm.
transnational conversations. I'm going to be setting up one in a few days with some people who have been for several years Russians who immigrated to the U.S. And I want a conversation with three or four of these people about the experience of moving and becoming part of a totally different, quite a different culture. And of course, you would fit in on that conversation, but it's better to have you separately because I don't know, were the things that surprised and shocked you when you first began your double life of being a Russian and a sort of a Canadian immigrant?
Mm, it was not a lot of surprises,
No?
I think. Yeah, because now living in big Russian city as Moscow, it's not so huge difference. different from living in Toronto or in New York as it was in Soviet times.
Okay.
Therefore, it's now more or less not the same, of course, because if you, for example, go to London, UK, or to Paris or Rome, it will be a lot of differences. But it's difference inside one big cluster of modern big city that's now organized in a more or less similar way.
Yeah, there are certain things that do trouble me more than others about this, any disparity in perception. On the one hand, I'm very, very engaged these days with what I consider a worse threat even than nuclear weapons. I think nuclear weapons have always been the worst for the last 40 years, the worst threat to humankind, because they could go off and that would be that. But there's an even worse threat now that isn't properly recognized, even by the International Panel on Climate Change, and that is the prospect of a big explosion of, or emissions anyway, of methane from the undersea Arctic oceans, the East Siberian Sea in particular. So I've been very concerned about that, and I want to devote much more attention to that, and also to the release of methane from the permafrost. Well, now, surprisingly, there is a wonderful group of people led by a woman. I can't think of her name, but a woman who studied this in the East Siberian Sea. But there's also, I read an article, I think it was the New York Times about a month or more ago, talking about what a great thing it was going to be for Russia. All this wonderful global warming was going to do great things for Russian agriculture, because look at all the land in Russia that could be used if it weren't all frozen. So now it's going to melt and you can grow things. Oh my God. I mean, don't they know what it's going to do? I mean, the release of methane from this permafrost is probably the worst threat that we have. And yet they were treating it as, I don't know where they got that idea that this was just a benign prospect. It certainly is something that, and then I talk to people in Moscow who say, well, you know, it's cold weather here. I don't see any problem about global warming. I mean, you know, and I say, you know, I've seen pictures of buildings in Siberia where the whole thing is crumbling because of the collapse of the soil. It's as if they don't know about it. Is the awareness of global warming less in Moscow than in Toronto, in your experience?
Yes, of course, less, and much less concerns about that in Russia, including Moscow, because few people actually concerned about this issue that who are engaged in studies of in climate, or who are some kind of environmental activists, but most of people are not so interested in these issues, and public discourse and public and government propaganda, they definitely do not think that it's important issue at all. Therefore, it's an official position of the government that it's not so important issue. Therefore, we can find it's very small amount of talks about that in public discourse, and it's not an issue for most of NGOs as well. Partially maybe because of some economic troubles, because economic during last decade, it's actually the decrease of the personal incomes in Russia. Therefore, people are preoccupied by these economic troubles, these economic matters, and it's not so easy to convince them that this is a kind of strategic threat for Russia and for the whole world. It's a reality, because it sounds as a kind of global issue that maybe will be important after 200 years or something like that. It's not a
Well,
problem of
yeah, I
current
suppose.
policymakers
Yeah, I
for the
guess you
nuclear
could say
devices.
that's true everywhere, that people have other things they have to be concerned about. But I think it's just largely it's too bad that the press is so unresponsive to concerns of that kind in the West as well as in Russia, but probably worse in Russia. I don't know. But we certainly, the problem is I've been concerned about nuclear weapons, and they don't pay attention to that. That there's no coverage for it, and now there's certainly no coverage of the prospect of this methane threat at all. You just don't get that. And people, even who are concerned about global warming in general, are not even aware of that, mostly because it's not been covered, and the IPCC isn't addressing it. That's really too bad, because we really do need the press to pay attention. Instead, they want to pay attention to, I don't know, the sex of life of some congressman or something.
Yeah, how it works. The problem of Russia, the most of big media outlets, they are controlled by the government, and they have the money from the budget. Therefore, it's very small amount of really free media.
But here, now
And
look here, it's not controlled here by the government, and yet they're just absolutely uniform. All the press covers the same stories. If you read whatever newspaper you read, there'll be whatever the item of the day is, the news of the day. They all agree on what it is, and they talk about that, and the TV shows as well. They talk about that, and to almost uniformly, as if there's only one or two big news items of the day, and that's all you have to talk about. Well, my God, I mean, there's so many other things that need attention that really it's pathetic.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, even in democracies, we have this kind of
Yeah.
issue. That's true. That's right. That's
Tell
right.
me something else, if I can change the subject a little bit, because you said that you're going to be giving a course on the sociology of law. And I haven't really gone into that. I'm a sociologist, but I'd be very interested to know what kind of material you're going to be addressing there. I certainly I mean, everybody needs to be concerned about justice systems and the extent to which our procedures of law enforcement and so on are legitimate and uncorruptible. But what do you cover in a course in Russia? Are you talking about Russian legal system or what?
First of all, it's an introductory course. Therefore, the big part of this course, it's some kind of classical sociological issues related with the views of Durkheim, Karl Marx, or Max Weber on law and legal issues. And how works modern legal system, what the problem of everyday law, how it works, the problem of crime and punishment, as well as some specifics of the Russian criminal justice system and the Russian legal system in general. But it's mostly on this sociological approach to the law and legal system.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not about the details in for example, how police work or how court work. Mostly, uh, uh, it's about general approach of
Mhm,
sociologists to law and crime. That
mhm,
crime, for example, is socially embedded. That it's not this approach of sociology. It's very different from approach of legal scholars, traditional legal scholars, or psychologists, and this kind of stuff. Therefore,
mhm.
it's a sociological approach to law and legal system.
Yeah, well, now I know that you also give courses, I think even here, or maybe especially here, on policing, right?
Yeah.
And are there significant differences between policing, well, different societies' approach to policing? What do you think about this, the thing that's been going on in North America about the no, the responses, the Black Lives Matter responses to the George Floyd killing, and the court case that's going on now about the trial of this killer? Uh, are there are there distinctive things about we hear people talking about, let's defund the police,
Yeah.
which I'm trying to imagine, well, what were you going to do instead? I don't know. What's your take on that, and what do you think that the Russian take on that would be? What do most Russians think of this controversy, if you know?
It's a big controversy,
Hmm?
but it's definitely not. It's not understandable for the Russian public at all. Honestly,
Really?
yeah. I mean, not police killing, police brutality, because Russian public knows about that a lot. Therefore, for these particular cases, it's more or less, from my point of view, it's more or less obvious, and therefore it's. But if we talk about this idea of abolish the police or
Mhm.
defund the police, it's another issue. It's definitely not the idea that discussed and is discussing in Russia at all.
Mhm. Well, it's
Uh,
not really discussed much anywhere seriously. I don't know anybody here who has a serious alternative proposal for what you would do about law enforcement without
However,
police.
I think it's a very useful conversation about that
Is it?
because we can discuss the problems that can emerge if we abolish the police. And this year I asked students to make an assignment about the abolish the police, to make a kind of thought experiment. What will be the outcome for your own, for example, for your own neighborhood if police will be abolished?
Uh, okay.
Yeah,
What did they
yeah,
say?
huh?
What did they most of them say?
Yeah, and I have a very good response from them, analytical, and because it's actually we actually the crime rate and crime it depends not only from police and policing. It depends from high spectrum of societal issues and economic issues.
Mhm.
Therefore, it doesn't mean if we, for example, abolish the police, it doesn't mean that immediately it will be a kind of explosion of crimes and we cannot go to the street at all. However, I think it's a good thoughtful it's a good thought experiment to think about the foundations and the function of the police in society.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you feel that your students' responses or their inquiry into this thing came up with an analysis that makes sense to you?
Yeah.
What did they say? Most of them. What did they predict would happen in their community? And are they right? Are they probably correct in their estimation of what would happen?
I think, I think they correct. First of all, they were different response for that, because there are some responses where that it's okay, we can do it, and the outcomes will be mixed, negative and positive as well. That if we, for example, provide more funds for social services, for how to tackle the problem of homelessness and other social issues, it will positive impact on crime rate and
Hmm.
crime.
Hmm. Hmm.
Therefore, if we develop a kind of um, mm, uh, communal support for vulnerable groups, and try to develop some programs, how to educate community and tackle some social issues, it will be a positive impact, influence on social problems and crime, finally.
Okay, I think a lot of people would agree that, but nevertheless maintain that you still have to have some sort of law enforcement mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
because no matter how you do it, you're still going to have some crime.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
would there be anybody who would have? I've heard people talk about things like having neighborhood uh, neighbors get together and walk the streets together to suppress crime in their community and that sort of thing. This was proposed by an old anarchist friend of mine.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a realistic solution, but there, people come up with various proposals, but I don't know anybody who would want to say, well, we can do away with law enforcement completely. Do you?
Of course, it's not for immediate solution. For me, it's a very good topic for conversation and for analysis,
Mhm.
because if we do that, if we do it in reality, it will be much more negative outcomes than positive ones.
Mhm.
And maybe one of the most negative outcome, it will be a criminalization of the elite. Because if we abolish the law enforcement, the police, it will be new criminal opportunities, not only for street level criminals, but for elite as well. And it's much more dangerous than the street level criminals, because
Ah,
usually their conversation about abolish the police, defund the police, it's on the level of neighborhoods and the level of street criminals, this kind. But it's not only the problem of street level crimes, it's a problem of first of all of elite crime, and it's white collar crime.
mhm, mhm.
How you can tackle that without law enforcement? It isn't possible at all. No community programs can help that.
Yeah,
Can
people
can
walking the
tackle that.
street are not going to take care of
Yeah.
robber barons, so to speak. Yeah.
That's right. Therefore, of course, it's not for the actual solutions. I mean, this kind of conversation.
Yeah,
For
right.
I think it's useful for students to think about the role and the function of the police,
Mhm.
how it's important, and what kind of real functions how police carry out in society.
Well, I hope you do put the same assignment in front of your Canadian students. It'd be interesting to compare their reactions. Anyway,
Yeah.
this has been great fun. It's time for us to quit, but we have to do this more often. It's just great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it was my great pleasure to talk to you, and thanks a lot for having me here.
Yeah, well, we'll have as soon as the pandemic is over, we'll go to lunch. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. There are some positive outcomes of pandemic that we are much more used to to use this kind of tools. Yeah,
Thanks so much, Leon. Take
yeah.
care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Take care. Have a great day. Yeah, bye.